They called him Lefty until he grew a new arm and sued everyone for defamation. Welcome to What If Horizons, the only podcast that dares to ask questions that make biologists weep, philosophers sweat, and insurance companies panic. Today's question: what if humans could regenerate limbs? Not metaphorically, not emotionally. I'm talking lizard level, sci-fi tier, tentacle out of your shoulder style regeneration. Imagine it. 1 minute you're slicing cucumbers a little too enthusiastically. The next, you're calmly picking up your detached finger like it's a dropped AirPod, muttering, "Give it a week." Suddenly, ER visits turn into lighthearted oops moments, and your clumsy uncle becomes a walking testimony to human resilience. In a world where losing a toe is no more traumatic than losing a sock, what does that mean for society, medicine, war, fashion, and crucially, professional juggling? Let's rewind a bit. In nature, regeneration isn't science fiction, it's Tuesday. Salamanders regrow limbs. Starfish regenerate arms. Even certain species of worms can recover from being split in two. It's enough to make human biology look like it was designed on a Monday morning after a rough weekend. We bruise like bananas, break like cheap plastic, and don't even come with backup parts. Frankly, it's embarrassing. But what if, through some genetic miracle, CRISPR, a radioactive smoothie, or maybe just a particularly determined TikTok trend, humans developed full limb regeneration? I'm talking fingers, toes, legs, arms. No prosthetics, no transplants. Just regrow it like a fancy houseplant. At first, there'd be confusion. Hospitals would be flooded with people unsure whether to panic or take selfies. Imagine the headlines: "Man grows third arm after New Year's fireworks mishap." Or, "Nation's children break limbs recreationally to skip school." Insurance companies would hold emergency meetings that begin with "oh no" and end with "we're doomed." And of course, pharmaceutical companies would try to bottle the process. Regrow Max would hit the market, promising faster, fuller, sexier limbs in just 3 weeks. The side effects? Mild itching, temporary limb duplication, and the unsettling sensation of fingers wiggling before they're fully formed. Let's not forget influencers. Soon, the internet would be awash in growth time lapses. Watch me regrow my thumb in 11 days. Like and subscribe for each phalange. Tutorials would emerge. Best lighting for regrow reels, top serums for symmetrical regeneration, and why I cut off my leg to go viral. Meanwhile, the fitness industry would pivot hard. Regeneration CrossFit, amputation yoga, sweat, burn, grow it back stronger. Gyms would market intentional limb days. Think of leg day, but more literal. Lose it to grow it, bro. But beneath the comedy lies the revolution. War would change overnight. No more permanent injury. Soldiers could recover from battlefield wounds like characters in a video game. Of course, this would escalate conflicts too. If nobody stays wounded, what deterrent remains? Generals might treat combat like a particularly aggressive sporting event. And what about crime? Knife fights would turn philosophical. You may cut off my arm, but in a month, I'll be back. Fistier than ever. Serial arm duelists would emerge, like medieval knights with Netflix deals. Courtrooms would fill with bizarre injury claims. "Your Honor, my client did indeed sever the plaintiff's leg, but we argue it was consensual performance art, and look, it's almost grown back." Occupational hazards would be redefined. Construction workers might work barefoot. Surgeons would start every operation with, "I'm going in," literally. "Don't worry, I'll grow it back." Even chefs might show off their knife skills with a casual "oops," followed by an arm regrowth montage set to jazz. Religions would fracture. Some would hail regeneration as divine proof of immortality. Others would call it an abomination. "Thou shalt not become a salamander." The Vatican would hold emergency sessions. One particularly flexible guru would claim to have regrown 8 arms and demand recognition as the reincarnation of Shiva. And then, of course, the lawyers would arrive. Because when limbs grow back, the possibilities and lawsuits are endless. Can you claim disability benefits for a lost leg that's halfway done regrowing? Is a regrown arm considered new for fingerprinting purposes? Can someone technically high-five themselves for crimes committed by their previous hand? By the end of week 1, the world would be divided into 2 camps: the cautious regrowers, who keep regeneration for emergencies, and the chaotic limb bloopers. people who treat their bodies like biological Lego sets. These are the folks walking around with mismatched arms, experimenting with shape, symmetry, and sometimes flavor. The brave, the unhinged, the influencers. And let's not even get started on what this means for sports, evolution, and dating. That, dear listeners, is coming up next. Because this is just the beginning. Stay with me, and let's explore a future where paper cuts mean nothing, amputations are optional, and human anatomy finally gets the patch update it's deserved since the Bronze Age. At first, regeneration seemed like a miracle. People wept openly on morning television, hugging the loved ones who had regrown limbs they'd lost decades ago. News anchors interviewed veterans who now had both legs again, even if one was still a bit fuzzy at the knee and looked like it was trying to remember what a shin was. "It's a little wobbly," said one former soldier. But hey, so is democracy. Hospitals were overwhelmed, not with emergencies, but with enthusiasm. Surgeons who'd trained for decades in delicate reconstructions were now being asked, "So, do I just wait?" Orthopedic doctors held press conferences to clarify, "Yes, it grows back. No, we cannot guarantee it'll look like the original. Yes, we know one guy grew 3 elbows. Please stop emailing us." And for a brief moment, the world basked in the glow of limb-based optimism. Until, inevitably, capitalism noticed. It began with beauty standards. Soon, limb regeneration wasn't just about healing. It was about customization. Clinics popped up offering limb enhancement services, longer fingers for pianists, perfectly symmetrical legs for influencers, pinkies pre-curved for optimal tea-sipping. "Why settle for your boring old arm?" one ad declared, "when you can regrow it in platinum proportions." Then came the brands. Nike released a regrow-friendly shoe that adapted as your foot reformed. Apple launched iArm, a smart prosthetic interface for your regrowing limb. It didn't do anything, but it looked sleek and made a satisfying chime when you flexed. Naturally, it cost $1,799. Soon, fashion followed. Runways featured models with stylized limb mutations, elbowless arms, triple-jointed knees, pinky-length extensions designed to whisper elegance. A Paris designer unveiled an entire line of gowns meant only for people regrowing their legs. "The asymmetry," he declared, "is the future of identity." Meanwhile, black markets exploded. Regeneration drugs, spliced genes, black market enhancements that claim to let you grow wings or tails or a hand that never lets go, which turned out to be a terrible idea on dates. One underground community, calling themselves the bioreformists, believed humans should return to their ancestral fish-like state and began regrowing fins. Their manifesto was titled "We Begin Again with Gills." Predictably, governments panicked. Policies were rushed into place. Limits were set. You could regrow your limbs, sure, but no more than 2 per calendar year. Anyone found deliberately injuring themselves for sport, profit, or social media clout was fined or forced to undergo structural integrity therapy, which involved being lectured by a holographic grandmother for 6 hours straight. And yet, enforcement proved difficult. Because with regeneration came anonymity. Your fingerprints could change. Your tattoos faded. Facial recognition failed when someone casually swapped out their nose. Identity theft entered its golden age. Not because people stole your bank info, but because they stole your elbow. And in this world, that was enough. The dating scene, too, spiraled into chaos. Bios on apps began listing limb history. Currently regrowing left arm. Full range of motion in 3 weeks. Past injuries, skydiving accident, sword juggling, bad breakup with a blender. One popular influencer released a book titled How to Know If They're the Original or Just Recently Regrown. But it wasn't all madness. There were practical revolutions. The disabled community saw massive shifts in access and independence. Prosthetics were replaced by patients. People who had lived for years without limbs suddenly had the choice. Regrow, don't regrow, modify. It became about autonomy, not conformity. Medical education transformed overnight. Surgeons now learn to guide regrowth, like gardeners tending a sapling. Stem cell specialists became the new celebrities, giving TED Talks titled, "Why Your Elbow Hates You, and What the Liver Can Teach the Leg." Entire new careers appeared. Regeneration coaches, limb stylists, joint whisperers, There was even a reality show called Grow It Back, where contestants competed to regrow the most aesthetically pleasing body part within a week, judged by a panel of stern orthopedic surgeons and one very enthusiastic circus clown. Some cultures embraced the change with spiritual fervor. In parts of Southeast Asia, temples were built honoring the blessed rebirth of flesh. In Brazil, regrowth festivals emerged, celebrating new limbs with fireworks, dancing, and awkward three-legged races. Meanwhile, certain religious leaders warned that tampering with divine anatomy would bring doom. "The Lord made your elbow once, and now you want 5. They shouted into microphones, to mixed reactions. In classrooms, children giggled as their health teachers explained that yes, accidents still hurt, but now they were mostly inconvenient rather than catastrophic. Monkey bars regained popularity, so did skateboards, and, worryingly, trampoline-based sword dueling. Yet beneath all this celebration, a quiet question lingered. What did this mean for mortality? Because if you could regrow a leg, what else could you regrow? We hadn't reached the heart, the brain, the soul, but science was marching there with a clipboard, a grant, and a smug expression. Some whispered of full-body resets. Others feared clones, duplicates, endless life. And a few, those rare creatures known as philosophers, simply sipped their wine and said, "Now we must redefine what it means to be whole." And so, as limbs blossomed and arms flexed anew, the world crept closer to a strange truth. When nothing is permanent, everything becomes a choice. And we were just beginning to learn what that meant. Regeneration quickly stopped being a miracle and started becoming a menu. In cities, limb cafes opened, quiet spaces where you could sip overpriced matcha while discussing with a consultant which body part you might refresh next. People sat on beanbags, twirling brochures titled Elbows 2.0, Form Meets Function, and 10 Fingers, 10 Personalities. There were even punch cards. Buy 5 regrows, get your 6th free. In the suburbs, neighborhood gossip evolved. It wasn't about divorces or affairs anymore. It was, did you hear Sharon regrew her legs 3 inches longer? Poor Tim looks like he married a coffee table now. Social media trended with hashtags like #reglowup and #newarmwhodis. Someone on TikTok tried to regrow a finger into a tiny flute and got millions of views before being banned for violating biological guidelines. Children, of course, adapted fastest. Schools faced chaos. Billy took off his toe again during lunch. Teachers sighed. He says it's a science project. Parents were split. Some encouraged careful regrowth for resilience, while others insisted on contracts. No limb shedding without permission. One progressive kindergarten introduced a grow zone, a padded corner with soothing music and a sign reading, "Let it grow, let it flow." But not all was cute and quirky. Regenerative sports leagues exploded in popularity. In the Extreme Limitational, athletes raced to complete dangerous stunts that would shatter bones and limbs, then regenerate before the next round. One contestant was famously quoted mid-regrow as saying, "Pain is temporary, but viral fame is forever." The quote was tattooed on his arm, which he accidentally regrew the next week, thus losing the tattoo and needing to start over. Meanwhile, the Olympics became a diplomatic nightmare. Should regenerated limbs be considered performance-enhancing? Were countries hiding genetic tweaks to make stronger regrowth? Could someone cut off a slow leg mid-race and sprint to victory on a newer model? By the third debate, the IOC nearly collapsed under the weight of existential questions like, is that even the same person who started the marathon? Of course, capitalism did what capitalism always does, ruin the miracle. Corporate contracts began including limb clauses, ensuring employees didn't intentionally shed arms during work hours to escape meetings or claim regrowth leave. One firm installed scanners that detected new growth tissue. If you have time to grow a new arm, a CEO announced, you have time to finish those spreadsheets. Workplace injuries shifted tone entirely. Construction crews stopped fearing falling beams and started holding limb regrowth betting pools. I say Tom gets his thumb back in 9 days. No way, man. 7, tops. He drinks that protein sludge. Insurance companies retaliated by implementing a natural limb fee. If you dare to keep your original body parts past the recommended regrowth cycle, you paid extra. Their vintage, one policy read, and therefore fragile. Actuaries were forced to learn biology, leading to several mid-career breakdowns and one particularly angry resignation letter written entirely in medical Latin. Dating apps added options like regrown in last 30 days, still attached to original limbs, experimental regenerator, open to partial partner merging, and yes, merging, because eventually someone asked the question, what if I grew someone else's limb? And someone else said, what if we grew parts together? And suddenly, couples were growing matching hands, symbolic shared fingers, or entire symmetrical arms that only worked when held. One performance artist couple regrew each other's arms, then legally adopted them. The ceremony was televised. It ended in synchronized hand ballet. Critics described it as beautiful, disturbing, and a funding mistake. Religion, naturally, fractured again. Some called regeneration a divine blessing, others a sign of moral decay. A few fringe groups insisted it was a hoax and limbs never actually left to begin with. It's all holograms, one man shouted while furiously kicking a bush. And in certain sects, self-removal became ritual. Followers would offer a finger or toe as a symbol of humility, only to regrow it during the next full moon. One pastor delivered a sermon titled The Gospel of the Fresh Limb, accompanied by interpretive dancers in compression socks. And yet, in all this madness, a strange kind of hope began to grow, quietly, slowly, like a fingertip in week 2. Terminal patients who had lost limbs to disease found not just restoration, but dignity. Survivors of accidents regained control over their bodies. Children who once faced lifetimes of limitation now looked forward to possibilities as open and curious as they were. And yes, not everything worked perfectly. Sometimes limbs grew crooked, or in pairs, or with strange tattoos that weren't there before. One man reportedly grew a second left foot and became a fashion icon for his asymmetric gait. Another woman regrew her arm, so quickly it punched her in the face mid-formation. But still, humanity adapted. Because deep down, we are builders, tinkerers, resilient bags of squishy optimism. You give us a miracle, and we'll break it, remix it, market it, and finally, somehow, make it mean something. The question, of course, is what comes next. Because if we can regrow a limb, can we regrow a mind? Can we regrow identity? And once we lose the fear of loss, do we lose the meaning of having? Stay with me. It gets weirder. By now, the novelty had worn off. Losing a limb was no longer a headline. It was Tuesday. The sight of someone casually carrying their detached hand in a Ziploc bag while sipping coffee with the other barely raised an eyebrow. Entire cities adjusted. Sidewalks featured regrowth patios, padded areas where folks could sit and wait while their foot reappeared. Pharmacies sold Regrow kits with protein gels, painkillers, and crossword puzzles for the boredom. But it was in the quiet spaces, hospitals, homes, and hearts, where the psychological effects began to take root. Therapists reported a new condition, regenerative dysphoria. People regrew limbs that didn't feel like theirs. They stared at their new arms and said, "That's not the elbow I remember." One man famously sued his body, claiming it had betrayed his sense of self by giving him a shin that reminded him of his ex-girlfriend. The court dismissed the case, but not before several philosophy majors dropped out in solidarity. Children who grew up with regeneration never knew true permanence. "This isn't my real nose," one 8-year-old said proudly. "I regrew it after I face-planted into a merry-go-round. Twice." They spoke of their bodies like apps, updated, improved, sometimes glitchy. A generation raised not on fear of injury, but on frustration that their left knee regrew slower than the right. Universities offered new majors: biopersonal design, ethics of flesh, emotional architecture. Professors lectured on the metaphysics of pain memory and whether a regrown limb held the trauma of its previous iteration. A rogue philosopher, Dr. Giles, gained a cult following after declaring that humans were now unstable meat puzzles drifting through a soup of identity. He later regrew an extra eyebrow on a dare and declared himself post-human. Meanwhile, crime took an unusual turn. A new wave of regenerative grifters emerged. They'd lose a limb in a dramatic accident, claim millions in insurance, then regrow it during a vacation in Bali. Authorities struggled. "By the time we prove fraud," one agent said, "they've already regrown their pinky and changed careers." Prisons had to rethink security. You could no longer trust fingerprints, DNA, or even physical descriptions. Suspect has a right arm. Possibly. For now, black market clinics popped up offering accelerated regrowth with unpredictable results. Some clients emerged with tentacle-like fingers, others with animal traits. One particularly chaotic surgeon in Budapest became famous for offering custom limb aesthetics, producing hands shaped like claws, hooves, or in one case, a small saxophone. The jazz community was divided. Religious institutions, already splintered, dived further into surreal interpretations. Some began collecting discarded limbs as relics. Others preached that regenerating more than 7 times was an affront to the divine blueprint. A church in Kansas started baptizing newly grown toes, insisting each one be spiritually cleared before rejoining society. Art responded as art does, with confusion and enthusiasm. A sculptor held a gallery of her own regrown fingers, each carefully painted and preserved in jars. A performance artist regrew her leg on stage over several weeks, selling tickets to each phase. The final show, when her big toe emerged mid-symphony, received a standing ovation and one fainting critic. Meanwhile, the military couldn't believe its luck. Regenerative troops meant endless deployments. Generals beamed at charts showing limb turnover efficiency. Soldiers were less thrilled. "Sure, I can grow back an arm," one grunt muttered, "but I can't grow back time." Others leaned in, creating elite squads known as Grow Ops, specialists trained to fight, lose, regrow, and return within the same campaign. Civilians responded with protest. No More Meat Cycles became a movement, advocating for ethical regrowth limits. Demonstrators wore shirts reading, "My body, my version," and carried signs like, "I miss my original ankles." They demanded transparency, regulation, and, somewhat oddly, the right to permanently keep scars as emotional landmarks. Politicians, never ones to ignore a trend, scrambled to appear pro-original or pro-regrowth, depending on the district. And still, in labs and backrooms, scientists pushed further. What about organs? Could we regrow hearts? Brains? A terrifying question loomed in the corridors of power. If we could regrow a body, could we regrow death? Underground startups promised renewal packages. A full body reset. You'd lie down, be put under, and awaken in a brand new version of yourself. Fresher, younger, slightly less inclined to fear stairs. Early adopters were wealthy, eccentric, and heavily NDA'd. Rumors swirled. Politicians who looked too smooth, billionaires with suspiciously perfect teeth, a pop star who reappeared at 22 after a very public 60th birthday. The public watched nervously, because when death is a choice, life becomes optional. And in that strange new world, where flesh was temporary and limbs were lifestyle accessories, the question of humanity became harder to answer. Were we still ourselves? Or just echoes of old versions, endlessly regenerated, forever drifting from origin? And if so, did it matter? The answers might be found in the next chapter of this wild, meat-regrowing saga. And trust me, it only gets stranger from here. There was a time when losing a limb meant tragedy. Now it meant Fashion Week. Paris unveiled a catwalk show called Limbfinity, where models strutted with neon arms, transparent legs, and limbs shaped like abstract art. Critics hailed it as a celebration of human resilience, and also mildly terrifying. A model famously walked with a regrown arm twisted into the shape of a swan and ended her runway by high-fiving herself, literally. Meanwhile, tech companies weren't far behind. Elon Musk 3.0, yes, there were rumors he'd regrown himself twice, unveiled the neural limb, a chip that could guide regeneration into pre-designed forms. Why grow an arm when you can grow an upgrade? He declared, moments before a prototype limb on stage flopped over like a soggy baguette. Still, pre-orders hit record highs. Tech bro culture exploded into full-blown regenerative extremism. Influencers filmed themselves cutting off pinkies for the Regrow challenge. One uploaded a time-lapse of his foot reappearing while sitting on a yoga ball and meditating to whale sounds. It got 82 million views. "I feel reborn," he whispered into the camera, as his left heel awkwardly unfolded like wet origami. But the most unnerving development came from a quiet corner of the biotech world: intentional versioning. People began storing digital scans of their favorite limb versions. This was my best arm, spring 2028. I want it again. Clinics emerged offering template restorations, essentially regrowing old arms, knees, or even facial structures from your own past. It was cosmetic surgery meets time travel. Nostalgia became flesh. One company offered couples the ability to limb match, grow identical fingers or feet as a show of eternal devotion. Another launched a controversial campaign, Grow Like Grandma, allowing descendants to regenerate limbs modeled after ancestors. The ad featured a smiling girl flexing a gnarled, veiny hand next to the tagline, "Her legacy lives on." The public response was somewhere between reverent and horrified. Of course, this led to identity crises. People began questioning whether they were still them. If your body had been entirely regrown over a decade, what remained? Was personality still rooted in bone, or did it, too, regenerate? Therapists began adding limb identity reconciliation to their services. Sessions started with the question, when you look at your knee, do you see yourself? One viral clip showed a man bursting into tears during therapy. "I don't recognize my own feet anymore." Millions related. Spiritualists pounced. New Age gurus marketed soul mapping services to synchronize your chakra memory with your regrown wrist. Energy healers claimed old trauma could be purged if you regrew your liver during a full moon. Gwyneth Paltrow launched a candle that smells like renewal and claimed it helped align your ankle frequencies. It sold out in 17 seconds. On the darker end of the spectrum, biocriminals found their niche. Underground clinics offered identity wipes, full limb replacement, and facial restructuring. Witness protection programs were obsolete. You could just vanish by shedding your appearance like a snake. One ex-assassin famously regrew her face 5 times before being caught. Her mugshot was a lineup of 8 different heads with captions like Tuesday and After Coffee. Cults popped up too, obviously. One called The Reflection preached that the soul only fully unlocked after 13 regrowth cycles. Members kept detailed journals of each iteration, rating their limbs like restaurants. Version 6. Elbow stiff, but vibes immaculate. Another cult, the True Originals, violently opposed regrowth. They held bonfires of regrowth brochures and prayed to a mannequin made of untouched limbs. Then came the legal chaos. Was a regrown body part still you in a contract? One man tried to avoid paying taxes by claiming, "That was my old hand that signed the forms." Courts were divided. A judge in Arizona ruled that regrown fingers couldn't be fingerprinted without consent. Meanwhile, in Texas, a senator attempted to outlaw liberal limb liberties, insisting that traditional anatomy was under attack. In sports, debates raged endlessly. The Regrowth League insisted that newly grown limbs gave no unfair advantage, except for that one guy who accidentally grew a springy tendon and cleared a 30-foot jump. "It's natural," he insisted. "Just newly natural." A scandal erupted when a football player regrew both legs with extra muscle density and set a new sprint record. Sponsors dropped him. The public was outraged. Then he regrew normal legs again, made a dramatic apology on daytime TV, and got signed to 3 new endorsements. This was the new reality, a world of endless possibility and infinite absurdity, where pain was optional, form was flexible, and permanence was passé, where people played with their bodies like clay and culture bent to match. But a new wave of questions was rising. Whispers in the labs, rumors in the dark corners of the web. If we can regrow the body, can we edit it? Not just how it looks, but how it thinks. What happens when we regenerate not just bones and skin, but behavior? That, my friends, is where things begin to get terrifying. Stick around. We're not even halfway to the weirdest part. As if redesigning your knees wasn't strange enough, now came the era of cognitive regeneration. It began quietly, with the promise of neurological enhancements during the regrowth process. One lab in Zurich, backed by 7 Nobel laureates, 2 sugar daddies, and a suspiciously chipper raccoon mascot, claimed they could not only regrow your spine, but fine-tune the nerve clusters for optimized mood and memory efficiency. Translation: you could regrow yourself with better vibes. The media lost its mind. "Grow happy," blared one headline. "Your next brain might be smarter than you," shouted another, missing the irony entirely. Talk shows invited guests who'd regrown their hippocampus with built-in stress resistance. "I haven't cried since," one woman beamed. "Even at my divorce." The audience applauded, confused but impressed. Soon, startups emerged promising emotional tuning during regrowth. Feeling anxious? Regrow your adrenal system with the Serene gland. Too nostalgic? Trim your hippocampus with the Memory Slim package. Want to become a morning person? Grow a pineal gland that produces motivational hormones on command. Why drink coffee? Their billboard teased, when your pancreas can chant affirmations. Predictably, billionaires took it too far. They began regenerating themselves into hyper-efficient versions. One CEO boasted of regrowing his brain's frontal lobe to eliminate empathy lag. Another ordered a limb set, genetically biased for shareholder loyalty. These new versions, dubbed neurotypes, started clustering in Silicon Valley. They claimed they were evolution with Wi-Fi. They had identical smiles, perfect posture, and not a single joke among them. Governments scrambled. New policies emerged, mandatory neuroregistry, mind audits, cognitive authenticity checks at airports. TSA agents held up cards asking travelers how they felt about abstract art or the smell of childhood. If your answer didn't match your baseline, you got pulled aside for a rethink scan. Religions panicked again, this time with a full rebrand. Some declared brains sacred and unchangeable. Others embraced the idea of regrowing the mind as a holy pilgrimage. One cult, the Temple of Thought 2.0, claimed their leader had regrown himself into direct communion with cosmic intelligence. His sermons were mostly humming noises and interpretive eyebrow movements. Meanwhile, the fashion industry kept pace. Headwear became the new battleground. Hats designed to showcase regrown skull symmetry. Tiaras that synced with neural pulses. Entire runways filled with models whose foreheads glowed gently from embedded biolights. "This is not a hat," one designer whispered. "This is the soul's outline." And yes, people began regrowing heads. It wasn't widespread yet, but experimental cases emerged. Individuals with degenerative diseases or catastrophic trauma received full cranial regeneration. The body stayed the same. The mind rebooted. Memories sometimes returned. Sometimes they didn't. One man woke up after brain regeneration, looked at his spouse, and simply asked, "Do I know you?" He then added, "And if I don't, may I get to know you again?" Somehow it was both heartbreaking and romantic. They went on a second first date. It trended on every platform for a week. But then came the incident. A private clinic in an undisclosed country, probably one with a very lenient stance on ethics and a strong tourism department, offered the unthinkable: personality resets. Not just trauma healing or memory edits. Full rewrites. You could regrow yourself into someone else. They called it neogenesis. People signed up in droves. Disgraced politicians. Scandal-ridden celebrities. Billionaires who wanted to become poets. One crime boss allegedly grew himself into a children's author named Uncle Pip. His book, The Toe Who Loved Too Much, won awards and confused generations. Public reaction was mixed. Some were horrified. "We are not clay," one protester yelled, waving a sign shaped like an original brain. Others celebrated. Finally, one woman tweeted, "I can delete the part of me that liked my ex." Philosophers, of course, combusted. Identity, they argued, was always fluid. Now it's just downloadable. One particularly dramatic professor declared that consciousness is now a social media filter you grow in your sleep. He then immediately applied for a neogenesis package labeled Melancholy French Poet. Schools had to revise curricula. Teachers now began the year with, "Please raise your hand if you've had a brain regrown in the last 12 months. Class discussions became harder to track. "Last week I agreed with Aristotle," one student complained, "but then I regrew a Kantian frontal lobe and now I hate him." And in the back corners of society, always the fringe, always the quiet weirdos, came a new fear. What if someone regrew you without your permission? Illicit labs offered cloning-adjacent services. You didn't need DNA anymore. Just a scan of someone's brain patterns, enough tissue, and the right cocktail of regeneratives. Whispers of shadow selves spread across encrypted forums. People who looked, spoke, and thought like you, but weren't you. They called them mirrors. One mirror was discovered giving motivational speeches as his original self slept in a coma. Another ran for office while the original was stuck in customs at a regenerational checkpoint. The two met. They shook hands. They both winked. One vanished. Nobody knows which one. So now, dear listener, the line has blurred. Not between life and death, not even between self and other, but between who you were yesterday and who you could become tomorrow. We are becoming a species of drafts, constantly revising, endlessly experimenting, no longer bound by bones, or memories, or even moods. We are humans 2.0, and somewhere between glorious innovation and catastrophic identity collapse is the truth we're too busy regrowing to confront. Stick around. The next layer of this existential onion is as juicy as it is disturbing. By now, the world was completely unrecognizable, not because buildings had changed, or cars flew, or Elon Musk had finally regrown into a humble sea sponge, but because no one could tell who was who anymore. Identity was now a suggestion, not a fact. Your barista might have been a dentist last week. Your mom could have regrown a rebellious teenage personality just for the weekend. The line between authenticity and aesthetic became so blurred it filed a restraining order against reality. At airports, boarding passes included the phrase "current version number." Passengers were scanned, not for bombs or weapons, but for rogue neural graphs. Sorry, sir, but you're currently listed as Greg version 4.3, and this flight only permits up to 4.2. Please wait for clearance or downgrade your empathy levels. Marriage vows changed, too. Do you promise to love this version and any subsequent iterations until deleted or dramatically restructured? I do. Unless you regrow a gamer personality again, in which case I reserve the right to throw you into a beanbag and reassess. Social media evolved into chaos. Platforms like FaceU, Me Again, and Instaclone encouraged people to post emotional updates from each regenerated version. Influencers no longer offered makeup tutorials. They did full neurostyle hauls. This week I'm channeling Arctic Monk with a hint of obsessive organization. Swipe left for my amygdala upgrade. And yes, capitalism reached peak unhinged. Corporations began offering limited edition personalities. Starbucks had a seasonal flavor called Pumpkin Spice Extrovert. Amazon delivered overnight a neural pack labeled Executive Function Deluxe with Gratitude Boost. McDonald's rolled out a campaign. Would you like fries with your frontal lobe? But not everyone embraced the chaos. A growing movement, calling themselves the Anchored, refused any regenerative modification beyond injury repair. They wore shirts reading, "I'm stuck with myself," and carried analog notebooks filled with memories they feared might get overwritten. They met weekly to play acoustic guitars, make awkward eye contact, and whisper, "Remember when?" The Anchored were mocked at first, then feared, because they remembered. They remembered what it meant to feel regret, to carry scars, to live with thoughts they didn't choose but had to confront. They became living archives of pre-regenerative humanity, messy, contradictory, and painfully grounded. And as society spiraled upward into version hyperoptimization, a new kind of dread crept in. The dread of permanence's extinction. Hospitals reported cases of neuroloop syndrome, where patients endlessly regrew emotional responses to the same experience. One woman grieved her grandmother's death 14 times in 14 ways. She described it as therapeutic, exhausting, and occasionally plagiarized. Therapists were helpless. "She's stuck in a cycle of self-curation," one said, like a playlist that never hits the right vibe. Children born into the regrowth era had never known finality. "Why do people die?" one 6-year-old asked. "Can't they just reboot?" Classrooms struggled to explain mortality when their students routinely regrew paper cuts into musical elbows just for fun. And somewhere in this psychological soup, something snapped. A university study revealed a disturbing trend. People were beginning to offload responsibility for past behavior by blaming previous versions of themselves. One man caught cheating in 17 different relationships claimed, "That was Kyle 2.1. I'm Kyle 4.0 now." Monogamy installed. Courts were overwhelmed. Lawsuits stacked up against former versions of people. One trial featured a man suing his own hand for slapping his boss, despite having regrown a new hand and a completely different personality. The jury deliberated for 3 days and then threw the gavel out the window. The judge just sighed and regenerated her patience. Meanwhile, religious prophets re-emerged. A man in Tokyo declared he was the final iteration of humanity and refused to blink. His followers shaved their heads, wore duplicate noses, and chanted "one self, many vessels" in synchronized Morse code. Another movement declared all versions equally holy and held weekly personality potlucks. But in labs, always the labs, the frontier kept moving. One biotech giant introduced a process called neuromerge. Two individuals could voluntarily combine thought structures during regrowth. Couples did it for love. Musicians did it for better bands. One startup offered a group discount for up to 5 friends to become one hive-mind roommate called Gregory. Gregory was late on rent. Ethicists screamed into the void. What is consent when you're not going to be the same person tomorrow? What happens when all your best decisions were made by a version you erased last Thursday? Can a soul be version control? And yet, life trudged on. Birthdays became confusing. Am I turning 31? Or am I just on my 8th personal reboot? Cake companies stopped writing names and instead just printed "Congratulations, this one seems nice." At funerals, it became tradition to share which version of the deceased people preferred. I always liked Carla 2.0. She was less judgy. Nah, 3.5 Carla had that salsa face. She was fun. Meanwhile, the rich, as always, took things further. They didn't just regrow. They commissioned entire personas from creative teams. This new version of me is inspired by James Dean, a golden retriever, and a 2006 iPod Shuffle. Personalities became curated like perfume, sold in pop-up boutiques with names like Mood and Flesh and Who Am I Today? The line between identity, memory, body, and desire shattered into a kaleidoscope of maybes. And as the rest of us floated in this sea of regenerative confusion, rewriting ourselves like frantic screenwriters under deadline, one chilling thought began to take hold. What if the only part of you that's truly real is the one you can't regenerate? Stick with me. We're heading into the deep end. The deep end, as it turns out, wasn't metaphorical. It was very real. A physical place. A government facility known only by the ironic codename Stillpoint, where the world's top minds were gathered to answer one final question. What if the soul doesn't regrow? No one wanted to ask it. Certainly no one wanted to fund it. But there it was, looming like an unpatched hole in a spaceship. For all our regrown muscles, redesigned brains, and curated personalities, there remained one haunting, unalterable constant, something that didn't come back, couldn't be copied, and refused to be genetically stimulated. The inexplicable thing, the unscannable essence. Call it soul, consciousness, the original spark. Whatever it was missing from every regenerated body. Stillpoint's lead researcher, a woman named Dr. Evie Korsgaard, who had regrown every major limb twice and once her entire spleen just to see if she could taste color, published a single line in her final paper. We can grow the body, we can grow the mind, but we cannot grow the IIT. People panicked. News anchors wept. Talk shows held 48-hour "Who Am I?" specials. A TikTok dance trend emerged where people mimed their past versions waving goodbye to their current selves, set to a slowed-down cover of Bohemian Rhapsody on pan flute. For once, the memes weren't enough. Something had shifted. People stopped regrowing for fun. Clinics went quiet. Self-help influencers deleted videos. The air grew heavier, not from pollution, but from the collective realization that no amount of regeneration could restore what some had unknowingly lost. The anchored were smug for exactly 37 hours. Then, predictably, they cracked. Being the only ones left with original selves suddenly felt claustrophobic. "We're fossils," one man whispered, living in a museum of pain and permanence. They began tentatively regrowing fingertips, then ears, then entire emotional responses. They cried as they did it, not from joy or grief, but from sheer, unfiltered confusion. And so the world reached the era of paradox, where no one wanted to regrow, but couldn't stop, where everyone was themselves, and absolutely no one was, where identity was a mood, the soul was a rumor, and even death was starting to feel like a productivity issue. Because yes, dear listener, death hadn't vanished. It had simply gotten shy. People still died. Accidents, age, unforeseen acts of quantum spite. But fewer and fewer were allowed to stay dead. Families regrew loved ones out of guilt, out of tradition, out of subscription packages that offered 3 regenerations and a free blender. And those who returned, they were off. Not monstrous, not evil, just slightly misaligned. Like a familiar song played half a beat too slow. They remembered things no one else did. They spoke in phrases that felt translated. They laughed at the wrong parts of stories. Some claimed they could feel a boundary inside their bodies, where the old self ended and the new one refused to begin. One woman went viral for confronting her regrown husband on livestream. "You're not him," she said, sobbing. "I am," he insisted, smiling too perfectly. But not the part one loved. The clip got 180 million views. The comment section was a war zone. Amid all this, corporate interests did what they do best, commodified the crisis. Welcome to SoulSure, the first company to offer spiritual insurance. Regrow your body with peace of mind. Our patented Spirit Sync technology ensures alignment with your core essence or your money back. Their jingle was disturbingly catchy. Their lawsuits, disturbingly frequent. Then came the whisper networks. People trading in illicit recordings of their original selves. Memories backed up to black market drives. One hacker group, Echoborn, offered a service to stitch fragments of old personalities back into regrown minds. Side effects included hallucinations, intrusive nostalgia, and unshakable feelings of déjà vu. And the final, ultimate question emerged. What happens if you regrow without ever having known who you were to begin with? Children born into this mess grew up with choice fatigue. Every emotion came with sliders. Every trait was customizable. One teenager famously changed personalities 12 times in a month and was awarded a scholarship for adaptive self-awareness. Another refused to regrow a broken leg out of protest, declaring, "Pain is the last honest thing we have." Poets became oracles again. Artists became prophets. Comedians became priests. Because when science fails to name the unnameable, the absurd becomes sacred. A stand-up special titled "The Me I Missed" broke all records. One sketch featured a man arguing with 6 versions of himself at a family dinner. The punchline? They all voted to leave. Alone at the table, he raised a glass and whispered, "Finally, some peace." And in Still Point, Dr. Korsgaard published one final theory before disappearing entirely. The soul does not grow. It does not regenerate. It does not upgrade. It remembers. It endures. And in a world that can change everything, it is the one thing that decides whether you are truly alive or just a very sophisticated echo. That line now appears on park benches, tattoos, and the loading screens of meditation apps. So here we are. Bodies, minds, names, rewritable. Memories, selective. Identities, themed. And somewhere behind it all, a tiny flickering ember, wondering if it's still allowed to matter. Hang tight, traveler. We're nearing the edge of what it means to be human. And spoiler alert, that edge is a lot weirder than advertised. By now, most people had come to terms with the fact that they were, in essence, walking software updates. Patch notes came with birthday cards. Happy version day replaced happy birthday. Grandparents tried to connect with their grandkids by asking, "So, what firmware are you running these days?" while struggling to remember if they'd met this version of them before. The world was a patchwork of selves. Humanity no longer evolved, it iterated. Relationships became software licenses. This marriage is valid for versions 4.1 through 6.0, with renegotiation pending major rewrites. One dating app filtered matches by emotional subroutines and ability to regrow compatible love languages. Looking for a partner with high loyalty, moderate ambition, and a regenerated sense of humor. Funerals became optional, not in the "we're all too busy" sense. More like, they'll probably be back next Thursday, but with slightly better posture. Memorial services were replaced by soft reboots. The bereaved gathered in bio lounges to wait out the regeneration. They swapped stories about old versions, placed bets on which quirks would stick, and stared nervously at the stasis tank bubbling in the corner. And yet, underneath the shiny chrome of progress, something was unraveling. It started subtly. People began noticing lag in their thoughts. Not forgetting things, just processing life like a tab with too many windows open. A phrase emerged on forums: cognitive ghosting. The sense that your current self was being haunted by choices made by versions you never remembered being. One man described waking up every morning with a personality hangover, memories of feelings he didn't recognize. "I cried over jazz last night," he wrote. "I've never liked jazz. Who was that guy?" Another woman regrew her nervous system with a confidence boost module, only to discover she had also inherited an unfamiliar craving for violence. She punched a vending machine and whispered, "Why did that feel nostalgic?" Mental health professionals didn't stand a chance. The diagnostic manual for regenerative disorders hit 3,000 pages. It was banned in 3 countries for being existentially contagious. The front page just said, "Are you sure this is still you?" Amid the confusion, a quiet terror emerged. Children. They'd begun doing something no adult expected. They stopped regenerating. Not all of them. Just enough to be unsettling. Kids as young as 6 refusing biotherapy after injuries, insisting they wanted to feel pain. Some wore scars like badges of honor. Others formed underground groups, the originals, who shared stories, hand-wrote journals, and refused to upgrade their personalities past version 1.0. A movement was born, not out of rebellion, but longing to stay, to be one thing, one version, oneself, no matter how flawed, messy, or incomplete. They were mocked at first, called glitchlings, Luddites, meat stayers. But when a teenage poet named Lila Grace published her manifesto, "I Am Enough," the world paused. Her lines were scrawled across city walls, sung in coffee houses, and quietly posted on therapist doors. "I want to be wrong and grow, not right and rewritten. I want to love someone who knows all my versions, and still wants the one I've never replaced." Soon, adults followed. Influencers made dramatic videos deleting their upgrade subscriptions. "I'm going raw, personality-wise." One billionaire gave a TED Talk titled, "I Grew Myself into a Stranger," and donated his Regeneration lab to an orphanage. For reasons still unclear, he also regrew his sense of shame. Even the regrowth clinics pivoted. Rebranding as authenticity support centers, they now offered gentle integration instead of complete rewrites. Ads changed from "be your best self" to "be the self you can sleep with." It was unclear if that was brilliant or wildly inappropriate. The turning point came with the announcement of Project Root, a global initiative funded jointly by governments, NGOs, and a surprisingly humble Jeff Bezos clone, aimed at helping people reconnect with their original self, whatever remained of it. It wasn't about deleting regenerated traits. It was about remembering the first spark. You had to sit for days. No screens, no upgrades, just you and your slowly resurfacing memories. The ones no one curated. The ones you didn't regrow to impress a date or land a job or pass the latest social trend. It was quiet and horrifying and beautiful. One woman emerged from a root session and simply said, "I remember the way my dad laughed when I was 5. I'd forgotten that laugh." A man remembered he used to hum when he read, and that no one had noticed. But he liked that. He didn't want it upgraded. Root was a revolution of slowing down, a movement of choosing permanence, even when imperfection screamed for edits, of living in the body, the brain, the mood that wasn't optimized, but was real. And here we are, standing at the edge of an age where we can change anything, except maybe what matters most. Because in the end, all the regeneration in the world means nothing if you can't sit quietly with yourself and say, "Yes, this is me. I've been here the whole time." But there's still one final question we haven't answered. What happens when the world, our planet, our species, decides it wants to regenerate too? That, dear listener, is where we'll end and begin again. Regeneration was no longer just a personal choice. It was planetary. The Earth, exhausted from centuries of being poked, paved, and politely ignored, seemed to collectively exhale. Oceans shifted. Fault lines grumbled. Forests, previously clear-cut and mourned with hashtags, began reclaiming cities faster than urban planners could say infrastructure. Some said it was natural. Others insisted it was a side effect of mass human regeneration, something about quantum consciousness echoing into the biosphere. A few whispered the Earth had simply had enough of our nonsense and decided to reboot herself out of spite. Regardless of the cause, the planet had entered its own versioning process. Volcanoes erupted with artistic flair. Lightning storms danced like rave parties. Rivers changed direction just to mess with Google Maps. Animals began exhibiting odd behavior. Whales sang songs in new keys. Cats held prolonged eye contact, as if judging your most recent limb regeneration, and pigeons stopped caring about breadcrumbs and started forming suspiciously well-organized committees. A global task force was formed, Project Gaia Patch. Their mission? Understand the planet's regrowth signals and prevent, if possible, a full ecological rewrite. Scientists worked around the clock, philosophers threw wine-soaked parties to cope, and the rest of us just kept updating our brains and hoping for the best. And then came the trees. They grew fast, faster than anyone predicted. Not just taller, smarter. Their root systems began pulsing with low-frequency vibrations, creating a global neural net of sentient flora. Biologists called it the verdant consciousness. Most people just called it the big green O. Forests stopped burning, not because fires didn't start, but because the trees refused to catch fire. They adapted, shifting their internal chemistry mid-flame. The Amazon uploaded a polite cease and desist letter to the United Nations written entirely in fern spores. Nature had joined the Regeneration Party, and humans, hilariously, weren't invited. Cities began reshaping. Roads cracked open to reveal ancient seed banks. Skyscrapers sprouted moss that whispered weird advice to passing joggers. Entire office buildings bloomed into wildflower towers overnight. Do not enter signs were replaced with just let it happen. It was glorious. It was terrifying. It was deeply inconvenient for anyone trying to find parking. And amidst all this, a new philosophy emerged, geo-human symbiosis. The belief that the Earth was not a resource, not a backdrop, but a co-evolving partner in regeneration. Churches began holding services in overgrown malls. Ceremonies involved hugging trees, but only with consent. If the branch moves, it's a yes, one guide explained solemnly. Corporations tried to capitalize, of course. Apple released the iTree. It syncs with your mood and drops apples when you're low on blood sugar. Tesla unveiled the Model G, a self-driving shrub with attitude. Meta built a forest-themed metaverse called Barkbook, which somehow still sold your data to a squirrel named Kevin. But the most profound shift wasn't technological, it was spiritual. People began asking themselves not, who am I now? But what am I growing toward? Workplaces adopted regeneration sabbaticals. Schools introduced courses like emotional composting and advanced rootedness. Meditation apps encouraged users to update slowly, like moss. And children, those stubborn little originality warriors, led the way. They planted things, tended things, asked weird, beautiful questions like, if the earth is regrowing, does that mean she forgives us? One kid famously declared on live TV, I want to be a tree when I grow up. A week later, a biotech firm offered a sapling regeneration package. The first customers? Retirees who wanted to spend eternity as shade. And slowly, quietly, the species shifted. We stopped trying to become perfect. We started trying to become part of. People still regenerated, but now with restraint. They kept their scars, their wrinkles, their strange, irrational fears of balloons. Not because they couldn't remove them, but because they finally understood that being human wasn't about erasing the past. It was about integrating it, composting it into wisdom. We danced again. We laughed, really laughed. Not the kind programmed into our serotonin centers, but the kind that bursts out when someone says something so stupidly true you nearly choke. We cried, not because our grief had been optimized, but because we missed things. Missed our old selves. Missed the mystery. Missed the part of life you don't get to control. And in that missing, we found meaning. Because maybe, just maybe, regeneration wasn't about becoming someone new. Maybe it was about remembering the sacred chaos of being someone new. Not a version, not a patch, just you. Gloriously weird, beautifully broken, wonderfully unfinished. And that, dear listener, is the what if we didn't see coming. Not what if we could regrow, but what if we didn't need to. Thank you for flying through this peculiar, hilarious, heartbreaking hypothetical with us. This has been What If Horizons, the podcast that dares to ask the ridiculous questions so you don't have to live in fear of the logical ones. Now go, touch a tree, tell someone your favorite version of yourself, and maybe, just for one afternoon, stay exactly who you are. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is not change at all,